Ancient history has had a bit of a resurgence in popular interest in recent times, and with it has come some alternative interpretations of various archaeological sites and artifacts. Among them is the identification of this conical, pine cone-like object as a representation of the pineal gland, a gland in the human brain responsible for all kinds of hormonal regulation, but it's also often considered in popular culture as the third eye. It's been called the seat of the soul and the locus of the connection between the natural and metaphysical worlds. So, is this a numinous creature in a Neo-Assyrian wall relief holding up a depiction of the pineal gland as a symbol of enlightenment and hidden esoteric knowledge? Let's dig in. The pinecone imagery is common across many cultures, and while some have connected them all as a kind of conspiracy involving enlightenment or secret knowledge, I just want to focus on the evidence from Mesopotamia. And now, I don't want to bury the lead here, so I'll just say I don't buy the pineal gland theory in any of its many iterations. But let me explain why and offer an alternative perspective. In archaeology, when you find an artifact, it doesn't mean anything, at least not inherently. Artifacts must be interpreted, and when it comes to interpretation, context is king. If we want to know how an artifact was originally used or understood, we have to interpret it within its context. Even more so when we're dealing with art and symbolism. If we take symbolic images out of their ideational context, we get into trouble real quick. In 1,000 years, scholars may say this represents a fruit. This was just a simple ideogram for a large cat. This was just used to represent birds. And imagine the think pieces and the many peer-reviewed papers trying to identify the species of bluebird depicted. Now, these obviously have a much larger symbolic load, but we need to understand them in the context in which they were produced. The same thing goes for the cone image. Did the Assyrians know about the pineal gland? Did they recognize it as a discrete organ within the matrix of the other brain matter? And if they did they also know its physiology and how it was distinct from other organs? Maybe. But other than the fact that the organ is shaped like a pine cone and the figure here is holding a pine cone-like object, we don't have a lot of good evidence that there should be a connection here. The interpretation is divorced from its original context. Now, if I don't think this is a good connection, what could it be? Well, when we look at it in its context, we have a few compelling options. The reliefs most commonly cited come from the Neo-Assyrian palace at Kalhu, also called Nimrud, and date to the reign of Ashurnasirpal II. The Assyrian king moved the capital from Ashur to this more northern location where a new city was rebuilt, including what archaeologists know as the Northwest Palace. The walls and doorways of this palace were filled with inscriptions and reliefs, many of which include composite creatures. These composite creatures are largely divided into two categories in the academic literature: Mishvizin, or hybrid creatures which are non-anthropomorphic and tend to be colossal in size. These include the Lamassu figures at the doorways. And then there are anthropomorphic figures which are usually referred to as genii in the academic literature. Based on just their artistic depictions, they should be considered numinous beings. They are winged and most either have animal body parts or have a horned helmet on a human head, all of which indicates we're dealing with non-natural entities. Several Neo-Assyrian textual sources, which we'll get into in a moment, strongly indicate that we can identify these figures as apkallu. The apkallu have a long mythic tradition going back to Sumerian myth. Originally, they were 7 sages endowed with supernatural wisdom and served in the court of the god Enki. But over the millennia, the traditions around the apkallu changed. In some traditions, they were humans bestowed with divine wisdom and esoteric knowledge that they gave to man. In other traditions, they were numinous creatures tasked with preserving the order of creation. And later Neo-Assyrian kings say that they have attained a knowledge equal to the apkallu. However, the apkallu seem to have taken on an apotropaic role in the Neo-Assyrian period. In a text known as Bit Maseri, which dates later than our period but is likely still relevant, there's a prescription for healing that uses apkallu figurines. This is for after someone has already become ill, and it includes apkallu figurines as part of the ritual. And we even have the names of the apkallu listed, though here they number 11, not the usual 7. Another text, cited as KAR 298 and found at Ashur, is a ritual text that is used for homeowners and instructs how to block evil before it even enters their home and how to drive off illness and plague before it can come. Among the various prescriptions is the burying of apkallu figurines. Umu apkallu, or human figure ones, were made of wood, and fish and bird apkallu were made of clay. The bird and fish apkallu are specifically stated to have in their left hands bandudu, and in the right, mulilu. Bandudu is an Akkadian term that means something like bucket. Mulilu derives from a word for clean or purify, and so mulilu literally means something like cleaner or purifier. Scholars have understandably identified the genie at Kalhu, the human, fish, and bird composite creatures carrying the cone and buckets, as apkallu. What this conical object and the bucket it's paired with actually are have been a subject of much debate. Many scholars believe that what the apkallu or genie are holding is either a conifer pine cone or Turkish pine cone, or more commonly, a male date palm inflorescence. Because the genie are typically holding this object up to a stylized tree that appears to be a depiction of a date palm, it's hypothesized that the being is fertilizing the date palm, or that it's a depiction of a ritual that originated in the real agricultural practice of hand fertilization of date palm trees. This would include taking a male inflorescence or flower to a female date palm tree and hand pollinating instead of relying on wind pollination. This would make this cone and the ritual involved likely signifying fertility. Its presence in the throne room would serve to reinforce the idea of the king as responsible for the productivity and vitality of the kingdom. While many scholars recognize that the date fertilization theory may be in the distant background of the symbolism here, it is most likely not the most salient feature of the iconography. The fact that textual sources refer to it as a cleaner or purifier and it's in the hands of apkallu for the specific reason of warding off evil should be our biggest clue on how to interpret this particular image. Also, because the bucket and cone are not confined only to the tree imagery, but also to individuals and empty spaces, we should probably look for another interpretation. Scholars like Ludovico Portuese, among others, have emphasized the apotropaic nature of not only this image, but most of the reliefs found in the Northwest Palace, and argue its purifying and warding effects are most relevant to interpretation. That is, when these images are interpreted contextually, keeping in mind their fine location, what was found around them, and the ideational framework of the time, an apotropaic and purifying function makes the most sense even when compared with all the other plausible interpretations. Again, scholars like Ludovico Portuese have analyzed the various reliefs in the palace and have found this idea of purification and warding of evil as a common thread throughout the imagery. For example, some reliefs depict apkallu or mishvesin holding a goat. This has been identified as the scapegoat, known from Neo-Assyrian rituals. In the Utuku Lemnutu, a text listing rituals for the warding of evil, particularly evil dreams and sickness, we find several scapegoat texts and evidence that these rituals were known throughout most of Mesopotamian recorded history. In one text we see, "To avert evil, I set up a scapegoat opposite the gate." So when we consider the several scapegoat ritual texts together with the reliefs, it's easy to see why these are regarded as holding a scapegoat. We also see apkallu holding fallow deer and a palm frond. In several exorcism texts, the antlers of a stag are ground into dust and used for purification and healing rituals. Palm fronds also feature in healing rituals. They also feature in rituals for the expelling of ghosts. Palm fronds are even used prophylactically. You are supposed to tie them to your arms to prevent the onset of headache and death. Some texts even link palm fronds with gateways. We see similar apotropaic functions for all the accoutrements of the figures in the reliefs: lambs, pomegranates, so-called tufted rosettes, plain rosettes, and maces. Some even have clear indications of use at doorways and gates in the text describing the rituals. Given that the cone and bucket are found with the apkallu, who are also found with these other motifs, it's reasonable to conclude that they had a similar function: purification and the warding of evil. The link here is interesting because in some texts, the Assyrian king underwent purification rituals to protect against curses and witchcraft which they were otherwise unaware of. But ritual purity was also important for coming into contact with the divine world, so it's not clear for which reason the purification is needed. But these also seem to be representations of real artifacts that had a real use case in real rituals. In Urartu, a kingdom north of Assyria, a silver bucket was found in the tomb of a prince. It even includes images on it comparable to those in the Northwest Palace. So if the bucket was a real artifact, it's reasonable that the cone was in fact a real object and not just a symbolic representation of something. And when you plot the reliefs with these variety of motifs, an interesting pattern emerges. These images appear primarily at doorways or other transitional places, as well as in places in close proximity to the king. Some of the reliefs with the cones are pointing to apparently nothing, but this is likely meant to represent the purification of people who passed by. They may even signify that officials conducted actual purity rituals at these locations in the palace. And the bucket actually seems to be the more important object here, as some reliefs only have the bucket and instead of a cone, the figure is holding up their hand or a plant. The bucket likely contains something like holy water, and the cone was a means of sprinkling and thereby ritualistically activating or releasing the purifying power of the water. And apparently the cone was not the only implement that could function that way. These reliefs reflect a hyper-conscious anxiety around the safety, both physical and metaphysical, of the king. The builders, perhaps at the instruction of the king, implemented countermeasures to ward off ill intent from both the natural and supernatural worlds. But why was there such a preoccupation with purification and the warding of evil? Ludovico Portuese again offers an important insight. Assyrian royal ideology considered the king as responsible for humanity before the gods. The welfare of humanity relied on the proper functioning of the Assyrian king and his ability to fulfill his royal responsibilities, many of which would have been enacted in the palace. Safeguarding the king and the places where he spent his time was more than just playing into the superstitions of a paranoid king, but a way of preventing all kinds of calamities that may befall an otherwise at-risk humanity. I think the cone and bucket motif was a potent apotropaic image that likely reflects a real-life purification ritual conducted by Assyrian officials. It may have its roots in date palm agriculture, but by the time of Ashurnasirpal II, it had lost much of its agricultural connection and instead was a potent image of purification and functioned apotropaically. While it's still plausible, within its original context, to see the apkallu in their role as sages and bringers of wisdom as bestowing some kind of esoteric knowledge, doesn't seem to be the easiest or most likely interpretation here. Instead, the cone is likely best understood as one of several apotropaic images meant to protect the Assyrian king from danger so he could faithfully fulfill his role as mediator between humanity and the gods.